Hey guys, I'm Inverse, and on today's episode of StratTalk, we are going to be taking a look at the build I like to do as Wehrmacht against British in 1v1s. Let's get this game started. Before I kind of dig into the nitty-gritty details of the build, I just kind of want to clarify and want to point out my focus and my intentions for this episode. I am not in any way trying to claim that this is the only Wehrmacht Tier 1 build that works well against Brits. I'm not saying it's necessarily the best Tier 1 build against Brits, but what I am saying is it is the build I prefer to do the most. I've had a fair amount of success with the build, and I'm doing it first because it is the build I know best. The Tier 1 build I know best against Brits in this matchup, and I will absolutely be covering some other builds in the near future, most notably Sepha's heavy Tier 1 into Tier 3 style, and Tommy's Pyro Spam into Tier 2, which are both excellent candidates for this series and will definitely be covered. I just need to get a little bit more experience with them. I want to get a few games in before I actually feel like I can talk about them. Now with that in mind, as I'm sure you've already noticed, we have a 3 Pioneer start with this build, as well as a quick bike. I like the 3 Pioneer start because it gives me a little bit of extra map control. It gives me a lot of map presence against a British player who is a lot more immobile in the early game. Generally, the only mobile unit the Brits have in the early game is the Bren carrier, and if you split up your Pioneers well, you can run away from the Bren a decent amount. Now, what I'm doing right now with the bike is I always want to be harassing this first recon squad with this bike instantly. This is the only reason, really, for having this bike so early in the game. You don't get any capping power out of it, anything like that. What you do get out of it is harassment and an ability to delay what your opponent is doing. I'm actually floating a lot of manpower and should have been getting a Volksgrenadier soon, but I'm not. The thing with this strategy is the action picks up pretty darn quick. The general build is MG, or not really MG, bike, Volks, MG, sniper. And the bike comes first to harass, like we're doing right here, and also because if I go 3 Pioneer start and I build the Wehrmacht quarters right away with my first Pioneer, the Pioneer that you start out with in the game, I'm going to have around 170, 180 manpower when that Wehrmacht quarters finishes, and that's a really nice timing that lines up with the 180 manpower cost of the bike. So that's one of the other reasons why I tend to get that bike first. Now what I want to be doing with it, as I mentioned before, is harassing that early recon squad, because your opponent has one of two choices to make when you come up with an early recon squad, or with an early bike rather, and start attacking his capping recon squad. He either lets you shoot at him while you're capping, in which case you're going to deal a lot of damage, and even if you don't deal manpower damage, like even if you don't actually kill a Tommy squad, which is what I did in this situation, you can absolutely deal health damage, which is nearly as good in the early game against a Brit player, because a Brit's going to have to pay munitions and build a casualty clearing station in order to actually repair, or not really repair, but heal that squad. So you're going to have a large window of opportunity where you're actually going to be able to take advantage of the lower health of any Tommy squad really that early in the game. Now, as you'll notice, I didn't really point this out, but I built a very early mine here. Mines are an integral part of this strategy because it's a strategy that involves an early sniper against Brits, and any sort of early sniper with only a single Volksgrenadier is going to be vulnerable to quick Bren carrier Russians. And with that in mind, I'm really going to want to blanket the area my sniper is going to be operating in with mines as much as possible. You'll notice I have one down here so I can retreat back here with the sniper safely. I have one here. I'm also going to be putting one right over here, and that basically covers off the 3 main approaches, not counting over here, which is another good area for a mine right down here. Those are the main approaches that a Bren carrier is going to take if he is going to be trying to counter a sniper. So those are the approaches I'm going to want to cover off and focus on as much as possible. So we notice right here, bam, 1 mine hit, and there's actually going to be a second Bren carrier in this game, which is slightly unusual. That's a very heavy tech investment so early in the game for a Brit player. There's the second Bren right there. 2 Brens is a very heavy tech investment early game, and this tells me some some things that I'm going to be able to take advantage of a little later in the game, most notably investing in earlier Grenadiers instead of earlier packs. Now, as we'll notice, I am getting my tier 2 upgrade. I have my sniper out. It's going to be moving around, trying to deal whatever damage it can. Now, once I have my tier 2 up, I'm going to want to build my tier 2 building. And there are a lot of ways you can follow up this build. Tier 2 is not necessarily the only way to do it. It is the way I prefer. And the reasons I prefer it are fairly simple. I find it a lot easier to deal with Staghounds in the late game with a heavy tier 2 base with veterancy and a couple of packs. I find if you go tier 3 with Blitz, it can be a little difficult to deal with those Staghounds, especially if your opponent mixes in some Cromwells, which can complicate things a little bit, especially when you've got a lot of infantry, a lot of Tommies in the mix as well. It can make for an uncomfortable mix that you don't really want to deal with. So, generally speaking, I almost always go for heavy tier 2 Gren spam. It's a very versatile way to follow up this opening against the Brits because it gives you a lot of infantry strength, especially with a med bunker, and with Vet 2 and then eventually Vet 3. So it's a lot of infantry strength. It's also a lot of anti-tank strength because Panzerschrecks on Grenadiers are excellent against Brit vehicles. All Brit vehicles are fairly weak to Panzerschrecks, especially when you have them in large numbers, which you can get if you heavily commit to Gren spam in the early game. And you also get the pack, obviously, which is an excellent utility unit and excellent damage dealer for just defense, really, against the heavy vehicles that Brits are going to employ, because that's pretty much the best way for a British player to exploit the weaknesses of a Wehrmacht player. If the British player just goes heavy Tommies, it's fairly weak, relatively speaking, of course, and you pretty much always want some sort of vehicle to play. The most difficult vehicle play for a Wehrmacht player to deal with when playing against a Brit player is very aggressive, very well microed, constantly incremented vehicle tech. So what I mean by that is a very well microed Bren carrier, followed up by a very well microed Stuart, followed up by a very well microed Cromwell, Staghound, so on and so forth. That makes tier 2 pretty much the ideal counter, in my opinion, to what Brits can do to a Wehrmacht player, simply because you have all the AT options combined with the anti-infantry options available to you for defense against Tommies and stuff like that. Now, this Brit player is going to the left-hand side, trying to harass a little bit. I'm being mobile with my sniper. You'll notice I'm sending it to the left-hand side. That's perfectly safe in this situation because the infantry squad I sent to the left is a Panzerschreck. And now what I'm also doing here is I'm focusing on the lieutenant. This is very important. It's something you should always do as a Wehrmacht player against Brits. No matter what, in any engagement, try to focus down the lieutenant as much as you can. A lieutenant will survive 2 sniper rounds from a sniper, but if he takes a little bit of damage, he'll only survive 1. The second sniper round will kill him, as you saw right there. And rebuilding lieutenants are heavy investments for the Brit player. He has to spend fuel on them, he has to waste build time and manpower he could be spending on Tommy squads, stuff like that, reinforcing, lots of stuff like that. Not to mention the fact that Brit veterancy is directly tied to the lieutenant, so killing the lieutenant essentially resets your opponent's veterancy, which is very, very useful. And as I mentioned a little bit earlier, I felt completely safe sending this sniper over to the left-hand side despite the Bren carriers, because I had a Panzerschreck on this Grenadier. That's a very important thing to keep in mind when playing against Brits. I'm going to lose the sniper right here. No! That's bad. I shouldn't lose the sniper. That's a very important thing to keep in mind against Brits, is how you support your sniper and how you support your general units. You're going to want to have a lot of anti-tank all around the map if you're trying to be all around the map. Simply because Brits tanks against a tier 2 whose heavy primary anti-tank is fairly immobile. Tier 2 is not very mobile when it comes to efficient anti-tank. The Gren isn't exactly efficient unless it gets Vet 3, or until it gets Vet 3 rather, in terms of countering heavier tanks. Against the Bren it's great. Against the Stuart in numbers it's fairly good. But against the Cromwell, against the Staghound, you absolutely need packs and support. So you definitely can use Grens to stall out vehicles when you're capping around the map, and that's definitely what you should be doing, because moving a pack around a lot is going to be very tedious and very difficult to do, because you're going to be caught out of position a lot because it's so slow and it has to be positioned so well. It's much better to keep your pack on the area that you feel your opponent is most likely to assault. It just makes it a little easier to micro, increases the effectiveness, because he's probably going to be shooting a bit more and you're wasting a lot less time moving around. You're probably not going to get caught either. Now, I decided to rebuild my sniper here. This is absolutely a matter of personal preference. I love snipers against Brits because they're not hard countered at all. If you micro properly, you should never lose a sniper to Brits. Any loss of a sniper to Brits is a mistake on your part in most situations. Unless your opponent flanks really well, or rushes in with a vehicle when you're not expecting it, or drops commandos and you don't have a prop war ready. Barring any sort of situation like that, you really have no excuse for losing a sniper against Brits. Now, if we look at the units right now, I have 2 Grens, I have a pack right here, I have fairly decent map control. I'm pushing off on the left hand side, once again sniper and Gren squad with Panzerschreck, just in case. And I'm going to be getting my Comcraft Center soon. I'm also going to be getting a med bunker soon. And I generally delay those 2 items against Brits because I like to be able to feel as safe as I possibly can before I decide to spend any unnecessary money on tech or on something like a med bunker, really. And given what I've killed 2 Brens, I've killed a Stuart, I have 2 Grens, I have a sniper, I still have my MG, I still have my Volksgrenadier, and I have a pack right now. I'm absolutely in a strong enough, stable enough position to begin getting those supplementary luxury tech options that I really want late game against a British player. Those 2 are mainly the Comcraft Center right here, and where are you? The bunker right here. This is going to give me a lot more strength going forward against the growing number of Tommy squads, because right now I do have a relatively low amount of infantry. I'm mainly relying on my sniper, on positioning, and on my MG at this point. I want to boost that strength as cost effectively as I possibly can, and cost effective is veterancy and med bunkers. Against a Brit player, it's very easy to use med bunkers well because you don't really have to do anything. You just have to put them there. You have a lot of Grens, you have a lot of infantry. Everything you have is infantry. Everything you have is med bunker fodder. It's very easy to use a med bunker against Brits. It's relatively easy. I mean, it's not like it's difficult to put a med bunker down, hit the medic upgrade, and wait for it to get 4 men. It's not exactly micro-intensive, but it's absolutely a key part of this strategy, and really a key part, in my opinion, of any Tier 2 based strategy against either Brits or Americans. Now, as we notice right now, I am pushing up a little bit. I do have my Vet 1. I'm going to be getting my Vet 2 as soon as I can. You'll notice with this strategy, as with many other strategies, the limiting factor is not fuel at all. I have a lot of fuel. It is manpower. I need to be able to balance between getting my upgrades and getting units I need to survive, and I need to push my opponent back. I can delay veterancy if I want. I'm going to be able to get another infantry unit because Vet 2, Vet 3, and Grenadiers are the same cost in terms of manpower. So getting Vet 2 and getting Vet 3 means I'm going to have 2 fewer Gren squads on the field at that time. Not to mention the fact that while the veterancy bonuses are upgrading, that's essentially money I have locked up in a tech that's not going to pay off for me in a little bit. Veterancy upgrades aren't exactly super long. They don't exactly take a ton of time to research, but there's definitely a timing in there for your opponent to rush in with a Gren squad or 2, or not a Gren squad, a Tommy squad or 2, or some vehicles or something when you're lower on units than you could be, because you're investing in a future tech that's not going to pay off with extra units, but with or with better longevity for the units you currently have. So as you'll notice right now, I'm fairly low on the units. I still only have 2 Grens. It's 15 minutes into the game right now, and I still only have 2 Gren squads. That's fairly low at this point in the game, but the fact that I've killed so much in the early game, I killed 2 Brens, I killed a Stuart, that drastically cut into my opponent's Tommy numbers and makes it a lot easier for me to hold the territory I have with the bare minimum number of units that I'm currently using. Grenade, grenade. Yeah, that's generally my reasoning behind teching versus buying units, is if I need to buy the units, I'll buy the units. Because if I don't have units, I die. That's pretty basic, but when people talk about, you know, getting veterancy as opposed to getting units, they don't really think of it in terms of what am I trading off if I get one or the other. If I get units, I get a lot of strength immediately, but I sacrifice strength later on we go, because I'm going to be draining a little more manpower because my units aren't going to be as strong. It's going to be a little more difficult for me to hold territory because my units aren't going to be as strong, but I'm going to have more units. So I'm going to have strength numbers, I'm going to have volume, which is a nice little temporary boost. And if your opponent is trying something funky, like they're trying for a lot of Stuarts, or they're trying for a really, really quick rush, you need those extra units to fend something like that off. And investing in something like tech at a time like that is not really suitable. But once you're in a fairly comfortable position, which I am right now, if you'll notice here, actually, did I get my Vet 3? Nope, I have not gotten my Vet 3 right now. I actually rebuilt a pack because I couldn't recrew this pack. I'm going to pause it for a second, just laugh at this. I couldn't recrew this pack because the recon or the commando glider landed right on it. So I tried to kill it and that didn't work. And then I started rebuilding this pack because I'm like, you know, I kind of need a pack. It's a little dangerous for me to not have a pack, and I'm in a fairly good position, so I can sacrifice a Grenadier at this point in order to buy a little bit of safety. And then I realized, hey, I'm just gonna salvage this. So this actually works. I'm gonna salvage it, and I can finally recruit it. So I'm gonna end up with 2 packs that I really don't need, but that's okay. Another key concept that I just mentioned is the notion of paying for safety and paying for security. It's something that's very important in any sort of RTS game, but it's the notion that you've done enough damage that you're going to sacrifice a bit of your advantage in order to ensure yourself against mistakes you might make in the future. So something like, hey, I killed a lot of his infantry. I've held him a lot. He's thrown a lot of manpower at me. I've killed a few tanks, I've killed a few vehicles, I've killed a lot of his infantry. What could he do to catch me off guard? What could he do that would win him the game if I'm not prepared? Generally speaking, in Company of Heroes, that's vehicle play or sniper play. That's kind of the 2 avenues that players can come back in game. Sniper play is more in the vanilla matchup, of course. Brits, it's more heavy vehicle play that you're not prepared for. So if you're ahead at any point against Brits, it's never a bad idea to buy an extra pack, to prepare yourself against vehicles, against staghounds a little bit more, because those are generally speaking the avenues that a Brit player will try to take in order to come back into a game. And those are also the avenues that Wehrmacht players tend to find themselves having a little bit of trouble with, especially as the game goes on a little bit later, because it's kind of uncomfortable sometimes, you know, you don't really know. It's a little difficult. They're high risk, high reward units, vehicles are. At least Brit vehicles are, and snipers, of course, but we won't really get into that too much. But if you can plan ahead and sacrifice, like, hey, I'm going to have a little bit less infantry strength, I'm going to have 1 less Gren, I'm going to maybe have 2 less Grens, I'm going to be able to defend against his Staghound whenever it comes. That makes dealing with Staghounds and dealing with any sort of vehicle play so much easier. Being prepared in advance makes Staghounds easy to deal with. You're not going to have any problems. You're going to be perfectly fine. You're going to be killing them. Everything's going to be happy, dandy. You're going to be smiles. And it's going to be great. But if you don't prepare for them, you can be in a lot of trouble. and they can be very difficult to deal with because they are very strong. They're fairly difficult to deal with in general, but if you are prepared for them, they're absolutely not a problem at all. So that's going to be game one. I'm going to jump into one more game, and then that's going to be it for this episode. I'll be back in a bit. Alright guys, let's jump into game number 2. It's going to be the same build, the same general concept in the early game. Now, my capping order on Stursdorf is going to be a little bit modified, because with a strategy like this, and with the focus of my early game being so heavily based on the sniper, I want to prioritize munitions as much as possible, and a map like Stursdorf makes that very easy, obviously, because there's a lot of munitions here, there's munitions here, here, over here, over here. Lots of munitions on this map. I'm going to want to be getting them as early as possible, because I'm going to be wanting to have as many mines down as I possibly can. If you notice the chat, I was actually streaming this game. I stream most of my ladder games over on Twitch TV at twitch.tv/InverseTV. I'm streaming almost every day. If you'd like to see some of these strategies you see in these videos in action, I definitely highly encourage you to check that out, as well as check out broadcast.fulltimegeek.de, which is a compilation of all active Company of Heroes streams, which I definitely encourage you to check out if you're at all interested in watching how players actually play this game, myself included. Now, as we see the bike coming out, going to be trying to harass as much as possible, as I did in the past game. If we notice, I'm getting my munitions up as soon as I can, focusing on this +16, which is very important. I'm going to want to be focusing on the left-hand side of this map, just because it's a lot easier to hold, and it gives me good access to the middle. I'm not too worried about fuel with this strategy, because the only fuel I need is enough fuel to get up to veterancy level 3, which is my main focus. I'm not really looking toward teching, because teching against Brits, I find, puts you in a precarious position, because if your opponent's just constantly building up units, building up vehicles while you're teching, you're going to find yourself with a fairly low unit count and a low tech count. You're not going to have much veterancy. You're not going to have any veterancy, really. And you're still going to have a low unit count, but you're going to have a far later payoff, and it's not going to be as effective as a Gren-based play. Now, we're going to see a few of the vulnerabilities of Gren-based play, namely artillery and focus. More so the fact that you have to be focused on a lot of different areas, and you have to be up to snuff with your infantry micro with a heavy Gren-based strategy, especially against artillery and against a Brit player who is all over the map. Now, the Brit player, actually I didn't mention this before, but the Brit player I played last game was Rangeroo 7, who is, I think, top 15 or something. This player is I was MIA, who is, as of the time of this recording, the 35th ranked Brit player on the ladder. Just in case you guys were wondering, because I did neglect to mention that in the previous game. Now, as we can see right here, using the bike alongside Volk squads in order to try and deal as much damage as possible. That was sloppy, losing that Pioneer. If you see your opponent focusing down repairing squads, always just stop them from repairing. Retreat them, do whatever you have to do. Don't let them continue to get shot, because Pioneers especially die incredibly quickly while being repaired. Now, in terms of other maps, I'm not going to be doing any more videos, or at least this section will not feature any other maps. I do this strategy personally on Langra. I find it to be a very good strategy on this map, or on that map. Also, obviously, Angleville, Stursdorf. Wreck Train is a little bit more difficult because it's so narrow, and artillery is very deadly. And there's a lot of green cover that if your opponent parks in, you can have a little bit of difficulty in the early and mid game trying to get out and stuff like that. Ruins of Ruin, actually haven't really played many Brits lately, so I can't really comment, though I would probably do either this or some sort of 5 Pio, 7 Pio Tier 2 opening. And that's really it for the Tier 1 maps that I play. Now, the one map I absolutely would not do the strategy on is Samoa. For various reasons, I find 5 Pio Tier 2 to be absolutely incredibly strong on Samoa. You get a lot of map control, there's a lot of positions for you to stall out with Pioneers. Grenadiers are very powerful in the middle because the houses in the middle and all the green cover makes Grenadiers far more reliable in terms of AT. Because they live a lot longer, they're a lot more versatile when they're in buildings and when they're in green cover like that. So a map like that is absolutely a map I would prefer something like 5 Pio Tier 2 on. A map like this I would actually never do 5 Pio Tier 2 on, and I'm actually going to pause and point this out because this was something I learned the hard way, and I want you guys to learn this as well so you don't do it either. You can go 5 Pio Tier 2 on Stursdorf, and if your opponent plays normally, if your opponent does what my opponent is doing, you're going to be in perfectly fine shape. You're going to get an early med bunker, you're going to get an early Tier 2, you're going to be okay. If you play it out properly, you're probably going to be in perfectly fine shape. Now, if your opponent plays weird, and your opponent says, hey, I'm going to box my first recon squad, I'm going to click on your base, I'm going to right click in the middle of your base, I'm going to walk right into your HQ sector, and I'm going to make sure you cannot build your Tier 2 building. You can get your Tier 2 building up. You're definitely going to be able to get your Tier 2 building up. You're going to have to build a lot of Pioneers. You're going to have to build and probably lose a lot of Pioneers, because Pioneers, when they're trying to build stuff, aren't good at killing stuff. When you don't have a large concentration of Pioneers, and you're trying to kill a recon squad that is joined by a second Tommy squad, and eventually a Bren carrier, it gets a little rough. And that's just something to kind of think about if you really like 5 Pio Tier 2 as your opening against Brits. It's very powerful, and it's very good if your opponent plays standard. But if you're playing on a map that your opponent can just walk into your base on, and your opponent decides to do that, to just walk straight into your base, it's going to be a little difficult. So that's just something to keep in mind, because I managed to get Tier 2 up in that game, but the losses you take, you're set back in terms of map control, because your opponent can just cut you off and slowly cap back with lieutenants and maybe a Tommy squad while you're just trying to fight your way out of your base. It's absolutely nasty. But let's get on with the topic at hand, which is this strategy. Now, a little bit note on the sniper micro. As I mentioned in the previous game, you should absolutely never lose a sniper to a Brit player. The reasons for that are a few. First of all, with an early bike, you should have the vision to be able to shoot beyond the sniper's vision range. A sniper has more range with its weapon than it has sight range. So if you have something to spot for it, it can shoot a lot further than it can see. And the range of the Brit player's recon squad's snipe ability is fairly short. If you keep some sort of unit in front to spot and have your MG well positioned and have your bike around, bikes are absolutely essential to defending snipers because they can push squads that are trying to rush your sniper. Your sniper. I don't know why I said that so strange. Your sniper. That was really strange. But yeah, the sniper, or the bike rather. Sorry, completely. I'm trying to think what that voice was. I don't know what that voice was. Sniper. Your sniper. I have no idea. It's because I was listening to GFW radio. Sean Elliott's voices get ingrained in my head. But anyways, the bike. Goodness gracious, the bike is able to push infantry squads, which is very useful, obviously, because you can delay your opponent's movement. You can get your sniper into position if your sniper was out of position. I'm still doing it. Still saying sniper. You can get your sniper into position if it was out of position, and it's very, very useful. Now, another thing to note is, I believe snipers, don't quote me on this because I've actually never had a recon squad miss my sniper, so I don't know if I'm just incredibly unlucky, because I've heard people tell me this. I've just never experienced it myself, and I have not taken the time, unfortunately, to look through the game files and see if this is actually the case. But snipers, while retreating, don't have, like, snipers, if they're not retreating, have a 100% chance to die to the Brit Recon Squad snipe ability. but have a less than 100% chance to die while retreating. That's what I've heard. I've never experienced it, so I have no idea if that's the truth. I'll try to look it up, but I'm not sure if I'll be able to find it, but we will see. So that's something you can think about trying if your opponent decides, or actually ends up getting too close to you. Now, another small sniper micro note is if you attack move and the closest thing to your sniper is a Bren squad, a lot of the time the sniper is going to target and take a shot at that Bren squad. It's kind of on the borderline of between your sniper's vision range and its actual range. If the Bren squad is inside your sniper's vision range and the other squad you actually want to be shooting is inside the weapons range but outside the vision range, if you just issue an attack move, your sniper is going to focus down the Bren squad. Actually, it's going to take a shot at the Bren squad. It does the same thing with jeeps, actually, and bikes. Snipers do, which is kind of funny. But that's what it's going to focus on. So you want to be as much as possible issuing individual attack commands, unless you're focusing and fighting on primarily or against primarily Tommies. And you're also going to want to be shooting and killing medics as much as possible. That's kind of a standard for any medics against any faction. You always want to be shooting the medics. Now, as we saw here, I did go for a early Gren this game. That was a while ago, of course, but I did go Gren, Pack Gren. And the reason I went early Gren was because my opponent went early Bren Carrier. And if my opponent goes early Bren Carrier, it's a combination of things. It's the early Bren Carrier and the fact that I have enough munitions for a Panzerschreck. These two things make me fairly confident in going for a later pack in favor of earlier infantry strength in terms of a Grenadier. If my opponent hadn't gone for that Bren Carrier, that means he's going to have a lot of fuel banked up. And he's probably going to be able to get that Stuart a little bit quicker. So it's going to be a little risky for me, even if I do have the Panzerschreck and the ability to get a Panzerschreck. It's going to be a little bit risky for me to go for that Panzerschreck right in the early game, because the Stuart has its canister shot ability, which can be very devastating to the Gren squad, and most Brit players just shoot it right at the Gren squad. The Gren squad with the Shrek, just bam, canister shot. If you're in a bad location, like you're all in a crater or something like that, it can actually kill the entire squad, which is rough as anything. You really do not want that, because that puts you so incredibly far behind at that point in the game. But it's also why you absolutely need to be on top of your infantry micro, because you should never have two infantry squads stacked on top of each other. You should never be able to allow a canister shot. We're actually going to see what happens when you don't do that and you make a mistake and you let your opponent get a canister shot on two clumped up units, because it is disgusting. It is so much damage in such a short amount of time, and then the Stuart still has his regular shots, so chances are if you don't lose squads right away, you're going to have two squads at bare minimum health. One of them's probably going to die, especially if he times his attack with a lot of Tommy squads coming up, which our opponent right now is doing. Now, if we look into the base, I don't want to miss the canister shot. I'm actually going to pause all analysis in order to watch this gruesomeness. Watch it. Ah! Look at that. Look at that. I was really lucky I didn't lose anything. Really lucky. I lost 4 men on this Gren. These were 2 full health squads. And this isn't even bad in terms of manpower. That's going to be bad in terms of munitions, because I'm probably going to have to waste 30, maybe 60 munitions on health kits, on health packs, if I want those 2 squads to be of any use whatsoever. Now, I have delayed my Compcraft Center a little bit this game. I am going to get it right now. I'm getting it after the bunker. And the main reason for that is just because I wasn't able to afford it, really. There's no other reason beside that. I did get an extra Gren because mainly positioning. What I find personally is if I don't have a Pioneer in place when I have, say, 300 manpower, instead of getting that Compcraft Center, and having to retreat a Pioneer or something like that, I'll invest in the extra grand that I'm going to be getting anyways, and I'll just push back that veterancy just a tiny little bit. At such an early point in the game, it's not too big of a deal. It's definitely going to push back my tech, but it's going to give me a bit more strength in the early game, and that's not ever a bad thing, really. So if you generally the sweet spot before you advance on tech, either up to tier 2 or up to veterancy, anything like that, is a pack and 2 grands. But don't necessarily feel limited to that and feel like, hey, I got a pack and 2 grands. I need to tech right now. If you don't have units in position, if you have the resources to get more units out, just make as efficient use of your resources as you possibly can is the best advice I could possibly give you. Now we do have a Cromwell out. I'm fairly well equipped to deal with it. I have my Vet 1 coming out right now. I have a high count of Grenadiers. I have 2 Panzerschrecks right now. Of course, my pack that's going to get decrewed. Run away, pack. You can't run away. I'm sorry. My pack, which is going to get decrewed, but I do have this Volk squad that's going to be able to come over and recrew it. Now, I am focusing on VPs a little bit, because if we look at the VP counter, it is ticking down precariously low, relatively speaking, of course, in my opponent's favor this game. And that's something you absolutely have to pay a lot of attention to on maps like Angleville, like Stursdorf, like Langres, maps like that, where it's very easy for your opponent to isolate 2 VPs and focus the fighting around the 3rd VP, which can make it a little difficult for you to actually push out and cap some VPs until it's too late, at a point where your opponent can just lean on you and force you to fight and delay until you get to the point where he just wins by VPs, which is never a situation you want to be in, because the late game Wehrmacht army, especially when you go something like Terror, is absolutely ridiculously hard for a Brit player to stop. And you want to be able to get to that late game and utilize that late game, and you can't do that if you're obviously losing and have lost because you didn't focus on VPs at all. And that's kind of that is actually entirely the rationale between the area I pushed up on in the last game on Angleville. If you remember that, I pushed up just to that VP and didn't try to push my luck any further. That VP is the area I want to be holding on that map, because I want to have 2 VPs. I want to force my opponent to attack me instead of forcing myself to attack my opponent, because that's never something you want to be doing. Especially against a Brit who can be very locked down, you want to have your MG. It's a lot easier to use MGs defensively than offensively. You want to have your MG in the battle dealing damage, and in order to do that best, you want to be defending. So that's kind of the rationale behind that. I did get a very quick Vet 2, and because I elected for that earlier 3rd Grenadier, we're gonna see me not get Vet 3 too quickly. Okay, that's perfectly cool too. Generally, you're gonna want Vet 3 once you hit 3 or 4 Grenadiers. Now, in a situation like this, where my map control is relatively speaking fairly low, I'm going to, generally speaking, lean a bit more toward getting an extra Grenadier squad out, so I can give myself a little more map presence. Because with Vet 2, you give yourself, as the Wehrmacht player, a lot of strength with your infantry that you didn't have with Vet 1. You have obviously the healing and stuff like that, but the elite armor is such a boost up from the general infantry armor that it makes Grenadiers so robust already that you can absolutely delay that Vet 3. Not too late, because it's essential against Cromwells and stuff like that, because it increases the lifespan and the life expectancy of a single unit, a single Grenadier man, which is fairly important because it saves manpower. Obviously, it wastes your opponent's time because he has to take more shots to deal the same amount of manpower damage. It optimizes your ability to use medkits, because once you have a decent amount of Panzerschrecks. There's not really too much you're using munitions on aside from prop wars against commandos. So you can be using a lot of med kits on Grenadiers and stuff like that just to save a bit of manpower. Now we have the Vet 3 coming up. Just to save a bit of manpower, because manpower is the limiting resource in this strategy, since it's so infantry intensive, so infantry heavy, and you are spending so much on reinforcing those infantry squads, since that's your main form of combat unit. Now we did see the first of many artillery barrages over here on this left hand side. We're going to see a few more, and we're going to see how important it is to constantly be spreading out your infantry squads. If you'll notice, at any one time, I never have 2 squads stacked on top of each other. And that's absolutely consciously. This is something I'm running through my head every second of my game. You'll notice, spreading things out, just keeping things in a line, in a concave, anything like that. It maximizes damage output while minimizing damage input, because your opponent can't lob a bunch of grenades in, can't lob artillery, obviously. You don't get hit by splash damage from tank shells because your units are all in a single group. Flamers, this doesn't really apply against Brits, but flamers are less effective because flamers are area of effect. So it's absolutely always important to keep your units as spread out as possible. You'll notice I always do this. This is something I tell myself I need to be doing all the time. That was fake artillery right there, and generally speaking, you can kind of figure out fake artillery from regular artillery, because if your opponent drops artillery on infantry squads that can just either retreat or move away, it's probably not going to be real. It's still definitely useful and smart of you to actually move away, or move away a little bit and wait for that first round to fall, because that first round falls fairly quickly. Now another way to see is there's one artillery dropped right here, one thing of smoke, and we're going to see a second thing of smoke right there very quickly afterwards. The cooldown for the fake smoke is fairly long. I mean, it's not super long, but it's fairly long. If your opponent drops two artillery flares within a very short amount of time, you can be almost certain one of them is going to be real. So you definitely want to be aware of that. And we're actually going to see an on-map in a second, and that's going to really showcase the importance of keeping your units spread out at all times. You should never be able, you should never lose more than a single squad to artillery. A single squad should be the worst case scenario, and it should be, hey, my opponent got incredibly lucky with an artillery shell, and he gibbed the entire squad in one round. That should be the only situation where you would lose an entire squad to artillery, because you should never have 2 squads in the same location. This was actually, I'm remembering this now. You hear that constant repeating, constant shooting. There's a bug where if something happens with a Bren, like a Bren machine gun squad, it actually just loops the sound file over and over and over again, and it drove me crazy throughout the game. I was actually screaming into my stream at one point because this was driving me so insane. But as we see right now, the artillery coming out, I'm spreading my squads away from the point of origin. Now, Brit artillery is unique to American artillery in that it is actually very accurate, like fairly accurate, at least relative to the American 105 howitzer. It's very accurate for artillery, especially if the Brit player has line of sight. So if you see where the first shell lands, you can more often than not move around, like micro around, and be able to dodge the remaining shells, the subsequent shells, without having to waste time retreating and reinforcing and stuff like that. Now, one thing I did not add into my composition this game, but which you absolutely can, and I would actually definitely recommend you add something like this into your composition, though it will increase the micro requirement, is a half track. Even if you don't put a Pioneer squad in the half track and don't use it for any sort of damage and just use it for reinforcing, it's absolutely worth it. The main strength of the Wehrmacht half track lies in the fact that Wehrmacht squads can heal on the field through medkits, and the only thing they gain from retreating is a little bit of defensive bonus. Oh, it finally stopped. Oh, thank you for sparing me the agony. But yeah, the only thing that retreating really gives Wehrmacht squads is a slight defensive bonus. It doesn't give healing like it does with all other factions, really. Americans and Panzer Elite have in-base healing. Brits have location-based healing around the casualty clearing station. Wehrmacht has healing in their territory with a little bit of munitions cost. So you don't gain much. You pretty much only lose. Oh, sniper dead. You pretty much only lose. You lose time. You lose efficiency and effectiveness by retreating. Now, as we see right here, I delayed my KT a little bit right now just to get another sniper out. I really like my snipers against Brits. As I mentioned in the last video, it's absolutely a matter of personal preference. If you feel like you have the micro necessary to use snipers, I absolutely recommend them. Obviously, the build does have a sniper built into it, and that is an essential part of this build, but if you do lose that sniper, once you have Vet 2 and Vet 3 Grens, it's not necessary to reinforce. Now, I also got a mortar pit. Well, not necessary to rebuild, rather, is what I meant to say. I did actually get a mortar pit. Not a mortar pit, a mortar team. The reason for that was this map in particular has a lot of good shot blocking that makes it easier to defend a mortar from artillery. Most maps, especially most wide open maps like Langres, like Angleville, it's very difficult to use mortars against Brits because they have such powerful artillery in the mortar pit, which can't really be counter-mortared traditionally in terms of counter-mortaring with your own mortar. And they obviously have the on-map howitzer as well. So artillery in general, stationary artillery at least, is difficult to use as Wehrmacht against Brits. It's absolutely not impossible, and in the right situation it can be very powerful, such as the case with this, which can pretty much cover both of these VPs and do a fairly good job of doing it. Now, as you'll notice right there, the moment I hear the artillery rounds, I'm instantly spreading out my squads. I'm instantly moving my squads around. I'm grouped up a little bit over here, but that's only because I know the artillery rounds are coming over here. Now, as we see, could be fake, could be real artillery coming down here. I am going to dodge out of it just in case, and it actually ended up being real artillery, so it's good that I dodged out of it. I actually lost something. What did I lose? I'm completely all over the place. I do have my KT though, and I haven't really talked too much about doctrine with this strategy. I'll take a little bit of time right now to talk about it. You can pretty much use all three doctrines against Brits to equal effectiveness. It mainly comes down to personal preference. I like terror a lot because I like having the ability to prop war commandos that are dropped into my back base trying to kill a sniper, an MG, a pack, something like that. I like to be able to prop war them. I also like to be able to prop war units that might be killing my sniper. I like prop war as a unit against Brits, and I also really like the King Tiger because it's very good against pretty much everything the Brit has. It's very good against Staghounds. We did not see Staghounds in either of these games, but this strategy with the Tier 2 follow-up and Terror is very, very good against Staghounds because it has all of the necessary counters built into the anti-infantry play anyways. It has a pack built in because you need a pack. It has a lot of Grens with Veterancy and Panzerschrecks because they're just very solid, strong, versatile units against Brits. It has the ability for you to add a second pack if you need it, which you absolutely should do against Stags in my opinion. It has the King Tiger, which is excellent against Stags. Stags do not do very much at all against King Tigers. He actually took a Panzerschreck. Go. But yeah, the King Tiger is very good against Stags, very good against every Brit tank except the Firefly. However, when used in conjunction with a lot of vetted Grens with Panzerschrecks, Fireflies are very difficult for a Brit player to use effectively because he has to get relatively close, and you should have a buffer zone of Grenadiers in front of your King Tiger at all times. And you have a lot of leeway with your King Tiger because it has so much health, it has so much armor, it can back out and be healed, be repaired, stuff like that. Now, there are a lot of players who are partial to blitz against Brits. I don't like blitz with this particular strategy. That's not to say it's not a good doctrine to use against Brits. It absolutely is. The stew is very strong against Brit emplacements and Brit trucks, not to mention infantry, of course, and has a decent amount of armor that is difficult for the British light tanks to deal with. A lot of the Brit armor is relatively light. Even Cromwells have a decently difficult time against a lot of the Wehrmacht armor. And defensive, of course, has For the Fatherland, which is very powerful when combined with Vet 3 Grenadiers. It's very difficult for a Brit player to push into territory that has For the Fatherland enabled and active and a lot of Vet 3 Grens. It pretty much makes the Wehrmacht infantry orders of magnitude more powerful than the Brit infantry, which is nice for players who find themselves overwhelmed a lot by very heavy Tommy blobs, which you absolutely don't need. You don't need defensive against stuff like that, but it can definitely help. And obviously the Flak 88, the Flak 88 very good as well against the Stags and against the Sherman or the Cromwells and the Fireflies, stuff like that. But that's gonna be it for this take on my preferred strategy against the British. Of course, if you have any questions, comments, concerns, anything like that, I would love to hear from them. Post them down below in the comments. Let me know what kind of strategies you'd like to see, what kind of discussions you'd like to see in this particular segment. I'm still looking for ideas for subsequent segments. I'm kind of drawing off my personal experiences right now, what I like to do and what I like to use, since that is what I have the most experience with right now. But if you guys let me know generally what you guys would like to see, I'll be able to focus on learning and researching some builds in those specific areas, and I'll be able to talk about them on the show. I'm also going to be preparing and planning out some more US vs. PE case studies with a very special guest as well, which I'm very excited about, and which you will meet in the next episode, hopefully. But aside from that, check me out on Twitch, twitch.tv/InverseTV. I'm on Twitter, twitter.com/InverseTV. Subscribe on YouTube if you like what you see. It definitely helps. Follow on Twitch if you enjoy what I do over there. And that's it. See you guys next time.